Hello, so today I wanted to talk a little bit about min cap, or the idea of playing a less optimal final board with the intention of getting a better placement in the game. This is a key concept that I wanted to discuss and kind of bring up because, as you know, if you've seen this channel before, I do daily TFT guides, and one of the guides that I did yesterday was talking about board optimizations. I was talking a lot about how you can cap your board really high, different ways to make the most out of your boards, and how to make certain boards a little bit stronger by either adding 5 costs or extra synergies and trying to find like the strongest potential board. Now that is still something that matters a lot of the time. That is still something you're gonna do in almost every game of TFT. You're always gonna try and play the strongest board that's available to you, but the key thing is the strongest board that is available to you. So in a lot of games when you're playing TFT, also by the way, we're working on a 10,000 sub goal giveaway, so make sure to like and subscribe if you're looking forward to that. But in a lot of games, you might want to end up with a weaker board. Now, I'm not saying you're playing a weaker board at every stage of the game, like you're not trying to lose streak or anything. What I mean is that you're aiming for a final board that is not as strong as some of the other counterparts. So for example, like let's say you're aiming for a final board and you're playing like a Twisted Fate reroll, which will be an example we'll talk about in this video, right? You might not be able to go for every single unit 3-starred, so you might have to just, give up on certain things, right? If you're going for Twisted Fate 3, maybe you don't have enough gold, or you don't have the resources or the HP to hit a Draven 3. We all know that this board is way stronger if you have a Draven 3, but in some situations you would have to decide, do I have the resources to hit this unit? Equivalently, if you're playing certain other lines, for example, if you're playing like a Marksman Vanguard or some sort of Vanguard variation, you might not be able to hit all of your Marksman Vanguard units. In that case, maybe you don't have a Vanguard frontline. Instead, you play a suboptimal board, which is like a Bruiser frontline. This is sometimes popular, especially if you're very contested, because there are synergies that can work with some of the units, like you can still get Golden Ox in with an Alistar. This is another example that we can talk about a little bit. But the idea is not to say that 4 Bruiser, 4 Marksman is going to be better than 4 Vanguard, 4 Marksman. A lot of times, it just comes down to different situations you get put in, and you're playing a suboptimal final board with the intention of salvaging the game to the best of your ability. So the idea of a weaker board, or quote-unquote weaker board, a lot of it comes down to like if you're super contested, so if a lot of your units are getting bought and you can't hit the exact board that you want to hit. Sometimes you end up playing a weaker variation of a particular comp just for the sake of salvaging the game and trying to get your maximum placement that you can. Additionally, if you're very low HP, you have low win out potential a lot of the time. You're very close to like just losing the game. Even if you have the second strongest board in the lobby, if you're 1 HP, you're dead, you go 8th. It doesn't matter how strong your board is, it matters how strong you are relative to the lobby, and your HP plays a big role in that. So a lot of times you just want to make any board that you can, the strongest board that you can play, but a weaker final board without long-term prospects to kind of win out. And that's an idea of playing around a weaker final board or a min-cap style board. Additionally, you might just want a tempo. You might just be playing a board that is not the optimal board, but you're trying to punish lobby greed. A lot of times there's a concept in TFT that usually goes hand in hand, and that's the idea of your maximum potential with a certain comp, as well as the amount of gold generation that you have. The more resources you have to pump into your comp, the better your chances are to hit the maximum cap of that comp. Hit all the 3-stars, hit all of your upgrades, hit all of the levels, hit all of the units that you want. It all requires gold, because gold is the main interaction in the game. However, in order to gather gold and to create gold, you have to ensue a lot of risk, because if you spend your gold, you make your board stronger. If you keep your gold, you can earn interest, and then you can basically cap your board a lot higher. So a lot of times a lobby will have a lot of greed, so if your lobby's greeding a lot, you can punish them by just playing any board that you can muster up. As long as it has upgrades and it's stronger than other boards, you can actually have a lot of success and send a lot of people in that bot 4 and put yourself in a good spot to get LP in the game. So when we're talking about max cap, something is really important. Sorry, it's all on one slide by accident. But when you're playing for max cap, like if we're talking like this video, we're talking about min cap. If we're talking about max cap, for example, a lot of times greeting is the way that will give you the largest win out potential. A lot of times when you want to play for the strongest board possible, you want to be making 50 gold as many turns as possible. You want to be maximizing your resources. The more resources you have, the greater your chances are of hitting everything, upgrading, pushing levels, putting in extra units. You need the gold in order to make your board as strong as possible. So a lot of times you play greedy, you try and hold on to every dollar, hold on to every gold of interest to make sure that you hit as much gold as possible to give you the amount of resources in order to hit and commit to that really strong comp. A lot of times you want to do this with a strong win out potential comp because, you know, of course, if you play a comp that isn't particularly strong, that's more bread and buttery, it might be a little bit difficult to hit that max cap potential. For example, if you're playing really greedy and you have a lot of gold, something that can work out really well is AMP. AMP is one of the strongest, highest cap comps in the game right now, but it's also very risky because a lot of it hinges on you getting to a point where you're actually playing around 5 AMP. So a lot of times playing comps like these, we all know they're very strong, right? AMP is something that you can go first every single game if you hit, but if you're not in a good spot, if you don't have the HP and the gold to hit it, you can fizzle out very fast and you can lose before you even get the chance to hit all of the units that you want. Additionally, because it's a little bit reliant on Samira, there's like a little bit of luck and RNG involved that can make it a little bit difficult, especially if you don't have a lot of resources. So often if you're committing to a comp like this, you have to be able to greed, or you have to have wiggle room to generate the resources in order to make this super successful. A lot of times when people play around AMP nowadays, they take like double econ augments for that reason. They just play absolutely as greedy as possible, get as much gold as possible, and then try and turn on a dime and just absolutely win out because of how powerful the comp is. That's something that's playing for like a max cap. This is a max cap final board, and your max cap being, you know, playing around your 5 cost in order to have the highest win out potential. That's not something you can always do. So instead, sometimes you might want to play for a min cap. The idea is that instead of either committing to a comp or within the same comp that you're playing, deciding how you use your gold is really important. A lot of times you might want to use your gold a little bit earlier, and you play for the present, or quote unquote play for the present. The idea is that you're ensuing a lot less risk, or you're taking on a lot less risk. The idea is that instead of greeding and holding on to every dollar that you have, you spend as much as that, obviously at a reasonable interval, which we'll talk about afterwards, but you want to use it at such a point where instead of like, you know, trying to greed to hit like your highest potential, you're worried more about being strong in the present and playing for the present, because then, you know, you might not go first in the lobby, but you can still salvage a second, salvage a third, salvage a fourth, give yourself the potential to get a more guaranteed top 4, a quote unquote guaranteed placement. And a lot of times when you do this, you often commit to weaker comps. A lot of comps that cap out really high, they require a large amount of gold or resources in order to itemize units, in order to level up, in order to find the 5 costs, as well as have 3 stars. There's so many other ways and other things that can make the comp really strong, but sometimes with this, you just want to play, you know, a more aggressive style. You want to punish people that are greeding and play towards your present. It could bite you. Obviously, if you play against min cap and your whole lobby caps out their board really high, then you can still bot 4 just by nature of not being able to defeat anybody. But the idea behind it a lot of times is that you take your guaranteed placements and then you convert that into your top 4 and then move on with your life. Remember, so this is a really important thing to remember. Everybody knows what the broken final boards are, right? Everybody can open up a tab while they're even while they're playing the game, right? You don't even have to memorize it. While you're playing the game, you can just open up on your phone what's the best comp in the game right now, and most of them will say around some of the comps that are pretty good, but it's very easy to just know what a strong comp is. Everybody knows what these broken final boards are, but a lot of times placements are about the journey getting there. It's not about knowing what the final board is. A lot of times you have to make decisions in your game based on what's happening in your game. You can try and play every single game like first or eighth, saying I'm gonna win out. That's a valid playstyle, and if you're that type of player, go ahead. But the point of this guy that I'm talking about is sometimes you have to make critical judgments on, should I play around fully optimized max cap style board, or should I just commit to a comp or a play style that's going to give me a more reliable placement here, because there's already enough problems going on, right? If you don't have a good spot in the game, if there's other people that have high win potential, you want to just salvage the game, and that's what the idea is. This is about salvaging your games. And often, like I said before, strongest boards often are very risky. A lot of the boards that are the strongest, they're strong for a reason, because they take so many resources that it's hard to outcap them. So in order to do that, you need to have those resources, and that often gives you a lot of risk unless you're in a high roll spot and you're just winning out for free. So now I wanted to give some examples. So of course, there's the obvious example that people always give. If you're playing for high cap placements, a lot of times you're playing around 5 cost, playing around these high cost units, and it gives you like a very high win potential, but you also have a good chance of going bot 4. Something that is very consistent, something that helps you to get average placements a little bit higher, just in general, but not necessarily winning out every single lobby, is reroll comps. Reroll comps are very good at that, and one of the classic ones that we like to talk about just in general is the Twisted Fate reroll comp. And the idea behind it is you just play around Twisted Fate and Syndicate. It looks a little bit like this, and optimizations have had it so that you now play some of these other units like Draven, with some Divinicorps just to give you the extra frontline synergies. So let's break down this comp in multiple ways. So this comp already is not going to be necessarily the strongest comp in the patch. It's not going to be the most broken comp that's going to win you the game instantly. A lot of times when you commit to Twisted Fate early, it's because you have a good spot for it and you're saying, I'm just going to play for a top 4 and this is okay. So already you're committing to a comp that isn't necessarily broken, and you might not particularly like it, but if you have a good spot for it, the good thing about rerolls is that it's very hard to go 8th with it. It's very hard for you because you're investing your gold early and you're not playing super greedy for you to go very, like, you know, nosedive and just go straight to 8th. A lot of times in the worst case scenario, even if you miss on all your units, you'll end up at like a 6th, or like at worst a 7th, but usually like a 6th or a 5th, and sometimes you even clutch out a 4th, and that's usually what ends up happening if you don't have a good spot. And then if you have a good spot, you can play for 2nd, 3rd, and above, and whatever. When you're thinking about Twisted Fate as a line, however, there are many different optimizations that happen within the own line. So, for example, if you're playing around Twisted Fate and you want to play it the safest way possible, and you just want to guarantee any sort of placement, you just want to not go 8th, right? Let's say your game's going really bad and you just want to not go 8th. A lot of times this comp, you can go for Twisted Fate 3 and Darius 3. This is what I would call the minest cap, like the smallest way that you can, or weakest way you can play this board. A lot of times is going for Twisted Fate 3 and Darius 3. Darius 3 is not as good a tank as some of the other tanks that you have within this own comp, but a lot of times when you play around these two units, you're rolling on level 6. When you're rolling on level 6, you're at a lower level, you have less access to high cost units, but you have good odds of hitting both the Darius 3 and the Twisted Fate 3 because they're both 3 cost units, and you're investing your gold a lot earlier, which can often help you to not lose too much HP and be less susceptible to really RNG situations of like random people hitting random strong things, because you have the HP to like allow you to coast your way to an easier top 4. This is what playing around a min cap is. You're playing like a weaker board, and you're also choosing a weaker option in that board. If we're trying to optimize this board, the main way that people play it nowadays is that you don't actually roll on level 6. This Darius unit, we don't care about Darius that much. Instead, we just put Darius to the side, and hello Braum, and we level to level 7, and we go for Braum 3, Twisted Fate 3, and Draven 3. The idea is that with the Draven 3, you fill in a lot of the damage that TF leaves behind, especially while TF is ramping up, and the Braum is a much better tank than the Draven. So what you're doing here is, instead of rolling on level 6, you're now rolling on level 7 with this comp. That is a way to maximize the placement for this particular comp. However, rolling on level 7 gives you a lot more risk, because, or not that much more, but it gives you more risk, because the idea here is that now you have to hope that you had Twisted Fate on level 7, which the odds are a little bit less, but you should still be fine. You have to invest gold for Draven, which is expensive because he's going to be 27 gold, right? 3 costs, you need 9 copies of them. And you also need a lot of gold in order to hit this Braum. This Darius is a lot cheaper than Braum. So we expect the Darius to be worse than the Braum. He's cheaper, of course. He's a 2 cost, so he's going to cost 9 gold less for the 3-star version of him. However, this Braum is going to be a much better tank. So what we're doing is we're saying to ourselves, I want to get better placements with this Twisted Fate. I want to have a better win out potential. I'm going to roll on level 7. A lot of times, if you're in a bad spot, it can be awkward to do that, because if you just level to 7 without any 3 stars, you're kind of defeating the purpose of playing the reroll, and you can often be really weak until you kind of hit your board and get everything rolling. But with this type of play, especially if you can hit Braum 3 and Draven 3, you can actually have a really good chance of winning out. And additionally, if you hit MF2, maybe even, fuck it, you know, maybe you even hit a Darius 3 while you're rolling. These are ways to maximize the average placement of this particular comp. It works almost every comp. The more upgrades you have and the more units that are actually doing meaningful things, the stronger your comp is going to be. However, at one point, a lot of times you're an in-between strategy, right? You're not necessarily saying to yourself, I'll just roll on level 6 and get Draven and, Darius and TF and then call it a day, right? Usually you're not doing that. And at the same time, you know, you're not necessarily saying, I'm going to hit everything, because it takes a lot of gold, right? Each of these 3 stars, especially if there's not another reroll in the lobby, is going to take a lot of gold investment, which can be very difficult and can often lead you to going bot 4. So a lot of times you have to make decisions while you're playing the game, and you have to decide what you're doing at what point in the game. You have to decide, am I going to go for, like, you know, you need your front lines, you need Braum 3, this is essential if you're going for Braum 3 on level 7, but you won't hold on to extra Dariuses, because you understand that I don't have enough gold to hit everything, because I'm not in that powerful or commanding of a spot. So instead of going for Darius, you just keep your Darius as a Darius 2. Additionally, when you're rolling for your backline, sometimes with this comp, if you need to salvage the game, you don't really go for Draven. Now that's, you know, obviously going to be a game that's going very poorly, but sometimes you look at it and you say to yourself, I don't have enough gold to hit both this Braum 3 and this Draven 3, so therefore I will just stop going for the Draven, because as I upgrade and keep these copies on my bench, I'm losing interest, I'm losing gold, and I can better use that gold to hit these units and then push levels to try and get synergies. If you notice this board has 8 units on it, so, you know, I'm just assuming that you make it to level 8 at one point, that you can put the Gragas on there. These are ideas of playing a less optimal board. If you look at anybody and they play this board and they don't have a Draven 3, it's like, of course they're not going to go first, they're probably not going to go second, but they still have a good potential of going like 3rd or 4th, or in the worst case going 5th or 6th or 7th, but they're not going to go 8th. And the idea is that you're playing around, hitting your units a little bit earlier and hitting the units that matter, and then pushing levels for synergies, and purposely playing a weaker version of the board, but only in situations where you really need to. And that's the idea of, you know, or roughly the idea that I'm presenting around considering playing a weaker version, or playing a min cap. There's other variations of this that also matter, but at least in this case, you know, the recommendation always, if I were to tell you to play Twisted Fate, I would hope that you have enough gold to go for Twisted Fate 3, Draven 3, and Braum 3. I want that to be a takeaway. I'm not saying that this is something you do all the time. What I'm saying is, if you're in a bad spot, you can do this in order to make sure that you hit the key portions, right? Make sure that you hit, like, you know, Twisted Fate Lite, you know, like, or Twisted Fate, like, 9A, or whatever phone you use that's, like, the cheap version of, like, the regular phone, right? Like, you want to hit the version that gets you somewhat stable and somewhat strong without having to greed or hold on to all your gold, especially if you're not in a spot where you're going to win out anyways. Another concept that I wanted to talk about, which I talked about a little bit before, was Vex. I talked about this in the optimizations guide, so I want to kind of clarify, which is part of the reason for this video. Vex has a lot of different ways to play around the board. So obviously you can play Vex, and usually you play Vex with Exotech, and the base board, like the normal board, looks something that a little bit like this. Where you play 5 Exotech with Vex, and then you usually put in a Morgana and a Gragas, and this is usually your board on level 8. With this board, you have a lot of optimization options, of course, right? Because you have, let me just open it up, boom. Here we go. So a lot of times when you're optimizing this board, a lot of times you drop to 3 Exotech if you have all the upgrades and your Exotech items aren't super impactful, and then you can start to play other 5 cost units, which usually ends up with something that looks a little bit like this. Zac has high win out potential, so you can play Zac, you can also play Renekton, and you can play Aurora, and this is more of like the AP focused Divinicorp line. Additionally, there are very strong versions of this Vex line where you actually play around Urgot with Bruisers instead. So what typically happens with that variation is that you end up playing around Cho'Gath and a 4 Bruiser front line, which looks a little bit like, I'm just looking for my last Bruiser unit. It's usually like a Kabuko, and you usually just drop out of some of the Exotech units, and you play something that looks a little bit closer to this, right, on level 9. And the idea is that instead of playing around Vex primarily as playing, like, you know, blue buff and AP items and itemizing Varus, you instead go for items on this Urgot, and the Urgot becomes your primary carry. Of course, there's other variations with Boombot that you can play 4 Boombot, 4 Bruiser, and you can drop some of these extra units. You can also drop some of the Exotech units, because if you don't have an Exotech item that you need on Varus, you don't even need the Sejuani, and then you can play more 5 costs, which looks something like this. But this is like a higher cap or the highest cap version of these type of boards, because this Urgot is probably the strongest that can make use. It's probably the strongest board that you can play, or one of the strongest boards you can play, next to Amp. And the idea is that, you know, Boombot with Urgot, especially if you have like the option to play 6 Boombot, or you can even play 4 Boombot with variations like this Urgot is just gonna melt through everybody, especially if you have an Urgot 2. If we compare all of the versions of this, there's like an idea that, you know, this one, using low cost units, it's very reliable. It's very easy for you to hit it, and you can usually try and transition to some of these boards late game. However, a lot of times you have to decide if you're committing to this variation, which caps out this way, or if you're committing to the Urgot variation, because a lot of times the Urgot variations, you have to prioritize Urgot items, because if you just try and pivot into this version with no Urgot items, good luck, right? So a lot of times, if you're playing around AP and Exotech, you usually just commit to this, and then you end up playing a board that looks similar to this when you level to 9. And a lot of times when you're thinking about these boards and which one to consider, a lot of it depends on your place in the actual point in the lobby. Something we talked about a lot on my channel before, you can check it out if you want to see more, is understanding like the own lobby tempo as well as your position in the lobby. If you're in a spot where you don't have a lot of HP, you're not in a high win out potential, and you don't have items for Urgot, you can't just commit to the stronger comp. Everybody knows this comp is this version, if you play around Urgot 2, you know, some of the units might change a little bit. This is just one of the versions of it. There's many versions, like I said, one with more Boombots, one with less Bruisers, one with more Exotech, one with less Exotech. But you don't have to commit to this version with Urgot, right? A lot of times you end up committing to this version just because it's, you know, something that is more reliable and consistent to hit. It's something that you can usually get a more reliable top 4 with, because of course if you just like try and send it and don't hit an Urgot, then what do you do in this variation? There's very little for you to do, because you don't have somebody to hold your items, and it just falls apart very fast. So the idea here that I'm trying to present, like I said before, min cap. This is something that happens quite a bit. If you are playing towards a line, you can still find optimizations with that line, and you can still play a board, even though it's not the quote-unquote strongest final board that you're going to hit. It's reliable and consistent up until you get to that final board. And a lot of times you have to commit to these things earlier, and it matters a lot how much your win potential is. If you're 100 streaking, right? If you're 100 HP and you have all board upgraded, I would commit to the stronger variation, right? I think here you can even drop this and play Viego. Like, there's so many ways to make this even stronger. You just keep dumping in 5 costs, right? Just play every 5 cost in the game, Vex and Urgot, right? It's absolutely insanely strong. But the idea is that you should only be committing to like these really strong comps if you have the potential to actually hit them. Because if you don't have good prospects for the game, a lot of times you want to play variations that still work. You can still win the lobby with this, right? This Divinicorp Zed board can still win the lobby, but you don't want to commit, or you want to overreach if you don't have the HP to work with, the econ to work with, or if your lobby has other win conditions that even if you hit the board, you're probably going to lose anyways. Think like a 10 anima or 7 anima. A key example of this is also when people commit to something like Amp. Now, Amp, you know, I'm probably going to get like the whole brigade of people telling me I don't know what I'm talking about, but this Amp board is very strong, right? A lot of times you play this, and then it's Zach, Garen, and usually play Nico and the other little dude, right? Strat Amp, but you just drop the strats and you just play 5 amp. This is one of the highest cap boards in the game. This board is absurdly strong. There are very few boards that can beat this. I've seen this board beat 3-star 4 costs. Like, it's that strong. Especially if you cap out with the Garen giving strategist mod to everybody. Because if you give strategist mod with this Garen and you can reach level 10 and shove in an extra strategist, or if you have a strategist emblem, like, you just absolutely rail every single person in the lobby. However, this comp is very temperamental. You need a lot of gold in order to find one Samira, let alone find Samira and the other 5 costs. It's very risky. It's very risky a lot of the times. There's ways to mitigate the risk, right? You can do it like as a mixture of reroll, right? You can reroll Nefiri. If you have good Nefiri items or artifacts that work with Nefiri, you can play that. Or if you can hit a Yumi 3, that's also pretty cool. But like, this is a comp that you usually commit to, and you're playing more of a 1st or 8th style, so you either want to play it from super ahead, or you want to have really good supporting augments to play around it. That's not to say that you shouldn't play it when you can, it's just that it's a sometimes food. you can't always play the strongest board. You could try, right? And you could have success with it, of course. I'm not saying not to do that. That's up to you. But for the most part, if you're trying to be consistent in your climb and you're trying to like learn the game and like, you know, figure out things along the way, it helps a lot to understand that if certain comps have a really high cap potential, a lot of times they're also very risky. So sometimes you have to decide to play a comp that might not necessarily be the highest win conditions, but will be a lot more consistent on your way getting there. But anyways, thanks for watching. Like I said, this video is mostly to go in conjunction with the other videos I posted in the last week or so. So, you know, it's a little bit like out there. It's not super like, you know, it's good knowledge, but it's not like super like I don't know how to say it, like shocking news, right? I think it's like very obvious what I said in this guide, but it's just something to make note of, right? Whether you're playing a reroll line or you're playing a 4-cost line, there are obviously going to be many variations of how you play it. But a lot of times you might want to just go for the variations that give you the more consistent placement instead of, you know, either contesting other people or finding spots where you'll put yourself in a very bad late game position that might cost you a lot of LP instead of gaining you the LP. But anyways, that was the guide for today. I think tomorrow will be a for fun video. I've decided that I'm going to do the item guides. For those of you that are waiting for the item guides, I was going to do them this week, but then there's the item guide changes. So now I'm just going to postpone them until the next patch. So they're going to come out not this week. They're going to come out the week after that. So apologies for that. Thank you for watching. Thanks for everybody who supports the channel. And yeah. We'll have fun. Next week also is going to be a lot of VOD reviews. If you're a VOD review enjoyer, I'm going to be gone over the weekend because I'm going to Anime Con that I have the artworks that I'm displaying there. So I'm going to be out for the weekend. So I'm going to be doing some extra for fun content next week to make sure I keep the daily uploads. And then we're going to go back to really informative guides the week after. But thanks for watching. Have a great day and see ya. Bye-bye.